most important, or in fact, according to Jack Ginsberg, the most major collective artist books in South Africa, the most major artist book in his opinion, and it's called Nesos, which is the Greek for island, and it was made by Walter Battiss in 1968. What is interesting about the book is that it is completely handmade, and what Battiss was trying to do at that time was create something that challenged the machine age, because already in 1968, that's 49 years ago, he was lamenting the fact that the craft and the ability of the human to do things by hand was starting to be neutralized and marginalized in society. And so his challenge was, with the making of this book, to make something completely by hand that nobody else touched in any way, except for the binder. He had to outsource the binding. And it's incredible to think, just looking at it, that it's in pristine condition. I've never seen a copy in such good shape. I've seen about 5 or 6 of these over the past 25 years, and this one is absolutely immaculate. The real key to Nesos for any collector is what you'll find written on the title page. They're all individualized by Battiss personally. So he wrote the colophone, or in another way, the front page, in pen and ink and by hand. As I say, each one was individualized, the design around the text. But basically, the short little synopsis explains exactly what makes Nesos so important. Because basically, in a nutshell, what he explains is that Nesos is the Greek word for island, and that in order to make this book, he visited 16 Greek islands. I know through my research that process started in about 1965, 1966, and ended in beginning of 1968 was the last trip before the making of this book. And at that time, he had made 7 trips to Greece. One must remember that he was a school teacher, so he always had his school holidays, and he was particularly interested in going in our winter months. So in the July, August holidays were always his favorite, because he could escape the cold here and go to a nice warm climate and lie on the beach in Greece. And so I think a big thing to realize with this book as well is that although Battiss was relaxing, like everyone else, and having a nice holiday, which he deserved, he worked very hard as a teacher, not just as an artist, everything in his life was directed towards his process of making art. So it was actually a research and development exercise. And so the culmination of those 6 or 7 trips to Greece are found in this book. Now, how the book works is he made every single silkscreen by hand, which again is also unusual, because one assumes that Battiss made most of his silkscreens personally. But in fact, he already started silkscreening seriously from 1972, once he retired. And in fact, he was one of the most visionary and advanced artists for South Africa at that time. He already employed, which is very clever, he already employed students and assistants to help him print. Because we estimate, in the making of the exhibition last year, Walter Battiss, I invented myself, that Battiss, just with silkscreens alone, has made in excess of 400 to 500, of which quite a percentage have still never been traced or seen, just to give an idea how prolific he was. But in most cases of those 500 silkscreens, I would argue that about 400 of them were printed by assistants or students or other printers, and only 100 were personally printed by Battiss. So in Nesos, you have 54 silkscreens, including images with text. Now, text, for anyone who makes silkscreens or any other kind of print, will know that it's extremely difficult. Making images, for a start, is tricky, but to make images that incorporate text is incredibly difficult. First of all, because you have to work the text in reverse before you print it, and it reflects in the correct way. And there is a general narrative in Nesos, but largely how it works is you have a silkscreen image like this one, and then it runs 1 through to 54, and there's a blank page between each. And how Battiss normally, he did change the way he made these books, but eventually, because he wanted to stop people from cutting them up, unfortunately, there were certain dealers early on, I won't mention any names, in the late 60s, who actually cut these books up because they were more profitable to sell as individual prints. He tried to avoid that happening by adding the title. He, in some copies, actually titled it on the interleafing page, which was a mistake. In these prints, these particular prints for Nesos, he titled most of them on the print itself in the margin, and then he'd also put the sequence number of the from the 1 through 54. So with this print Zeno, you can see, well, it's very small, but in the bottom right-hand corner there is a number 2. And the other thing that differentiates these prints in the way that they signed or the way that they inscribed is Battiss actually did the inscriptions and the signing in pen and ink, black pen and ink, which is unusual. Here's an example of a text page. Battiss was very taken not just by Greek civilization and Greek culture, he was an expert in both those fields, but he was also an expert and a great lover of poetry, and particularly Greek poetry. And Sappho is one of the most important early Greek poets, but also exceptional as she's one of the most important women poets in history. So that's an example of one of her works. And then just to give you an example here, I'm now on the 9th silkscreen, and out of the 54, I calculated, I think there are about 10 or 12 images that relate specifically to an aspect of Greek geography. So in this particular instance, this print and these images are titled Mykonos, and it's obviously a homage to the islands of Mykonos, which Battiss loved a great deal. We know this from his letters, particularly those found in the UNISA archive in Pretoria, that were written to a dear friend of his, Dacre Punt. Here's another example, although it's slightly to the south of the Greek, the main body of the Greek island chain. Battiss actually started very much earlier. I think in the early 60s was his first visit to Crete. And in fact, in my research, leading up to the making of the exhibition last year at the Wits Art Museum, you realize that if you look at Crete or Cretan civilization very carefully, it is the foundation to everything that comes later in Greece. So in fact, the Cretans or the Crete culture predates Greek civilization. So it's a very, very important geography and a civilization and history to consider. I'm choosing works more or less at random now, but this is certainly one of my favorites. I think what makes it exceptional is just the fact that you can see how, first of all, how dynamic the composition is. Obviously, one thinks immediately of in an international context of an artist like Henri Matisse. But it's just incredible to see how beautifully he's printed aspects of this, which really is just a celebration of not just rain, as it's titled. So rain, like you find in Japanese woodcuts, which are exceptional, is depicted just with these vertical lines running from top to bottom. But inside the composition, he's also included this very beautiful aspect of foliage, definitely some kind of a tree or a bush, because you see the leaf-like forms in green printed across the orange. You get this fabulous, obviously after most rain showers or during a rain shower, you're very lucky, but often happens, one sees a rainbow. In this instance as well, looking at it more technically, one can also see that the rainbow is printed last, because it actually superimposed across the black lines denoting the rain below. And then he's done this beautiful nude, which is very typical of Battiss's work. I mean, he loved both the male and the female nude body. he's shown a blue nude lying on what appears to be a black rock. And very, very beautiful image. And then, as it happens, the very next plate, another absolute masterpiece. In my opinion, I put these in the top 5 or 6 works, so just in pure visual power and inventiveness and quality. This one is titled Female Cyclops. I think what makes these works exceptional technically, particularly when showing them to anyone with knowledge in printing and knowing the silkscreen process, is the fact that there's actually a shadow. You might not see it on camera, but there's a printed shadow line that really, just to the edge of the red sections in this composition, that give this work a completely different and dynamic reading. There's also a slight little blue shadow line below the green at the base over here. And it just shows how masterful Battiss was as a silkscreen exponent. He was definitely, many would say, and I'd like to say as well, certainly our most accomplished and advanced silkscreen exponent. One mustn't forget, though, that there was a man by the name of Fred Schimmel, who I think was born in about 1928, so he was almost 20 years younger than Battiss. He immigrated from Holland to South Africa. He was a master screen printer. He had trained in Holland to the highest standards. And Battiss actually acknowledges that it was through Fred Schimmel that he really learned to become a master in the late 60s. In fact, Fred Schimmel gave a couple of silkscreening courses at UNISA where Battiss taught. And that's where he really got to master the silkscreen in South Africa at this time. But then one must remember that in 1969, just short of retiring, so just after making Nesos, he got a DARD scholarship, which is highly prestigious, to go to Germany and to study under a man by the name of Josef Kroll, who was a master of silkscreening. He was based in Munich, if I'm not mistaken. He was the professor of the printmaking school there. And for the first time, Battiss learned at that point how to incorporate photographs that he had taken into his silkscreens. And then in the early 70s, once he'd retired, he started to travel to London very much more frequently. And he started to print with a man by the name of Chris Patemba, who had a company called Advanced Graphics, who Battiss considered to be the best screen printer he had ever met, and he considered him to be way better than himself. Now, I think in certain ways that's unfair, because although Patemba was excellent, examples for those of you who want to try and see the difference, Patemba printed Fook Book 1 as an example. There's also a fabulous work that's well known called Liza, that's a homage to Liza Minnelli, done in London in 1973. And those are examples of prints done by Chris Patemba. And in my opinion, I have to say that I think Battiss was at least on an equal footing to Chris Patemba in quality. Then just jumping again at random, here is image number 24. Again, one sees wonderful humor, but sees a direct connection to early Greek civilization and the notion of Nesos, because this work is titled Dancers and Head of a Statue. Obviously, one assumes that Battiss went to one of the Acropolises or to an outdoor amphitheater or a museum and saw a broken sculpture, hence the head decapitated, lying sort of loose, maybe almost as a relic on the ground, and possibly either imagined dancing figures in the vicinity of this relic, and or people were actually dancing in the vicinity, and this became the source for a wonderful image. I've shown this book to Carl Nell about 2 years ago. I owned a copy of this, and I remember distinctly that although he admired the entire book and thought it was one of the most advanced things that he had seen, he was probably most taken by this particular image. A, because it's titled Female, so you have two sort of indications here. You have a female portrait, which shows Battiss already starting to try and articulate a photograph or photo-like image into a silkscreen. But you can also see from the genitalia at the base here that you're looking at, and with the breasts over here, that you're looking at a female figure. But what really impressed Carl Nell wasn't just the fact that this was a very advanced image looking at a Greek context or an international context, but it was such a contemporary African image for its time. And I know he was very impressed by this. Here is one of my favorites. In fact, we use this particular image, it's called Marathon, on the front cover of one of the 5 books that we produced, because the idea with the books having 5 different color linens was first to show Battiss, as one can see in this very print, to be a master colorist. But number 2, we wanted to try and give Battiss the credit for being a master in these 5 technical and conceptual areas of art making, whereas in most cases people always just think of an artist as being wonderful if they're a painter. So in most cases Battiss's books, of which there are many, are illustrated with a painting on the front cover. So although he was a marvelous painter, we wanted to indicate that he was a phenomenally good draftsman. And then when it came to a work to choose to illustrate the one for printmaking, obviously it was incredibly difficult, because he's a master of composition, he's a master of color, and he was just a brilliant printmaker. But as you can see with this image, I mean, it's just absolutely fantastic. In fact, many people at the book launch actually pointed to this cover, which has a blue linen surrounding this image, and said, "Oh, I'll buy the one of the painting, please." And we had to explain to him, no, actually, it looks like a painting, but actually that's a silkscreen. I'm getting towards the end now. I haven't been able to show you many really other wonderful examples, but I would just suggest that either you inquire with Strauss, or otherwise look on the internet, or otherwise refer to the book that we made last year, because every single image is reproduced in color. But this, I would argue, is one of the great images again. Again, titled Delphi, so paying homage to a particular part of Greece and a particular island that Battiss had visited. I picked this image as well because it was used, can't think of the exact date, probably in the middle 70s, for a cover of De Arte, which was actually the cultural magazine that Battiss was very much instrumental in sort of starting at UNISA in the late, well actually in the middle 1960s. And as a homage to Battiss once he retired, they, well actually a little later than that, Corin Skavron was commissioned to write a synopsis. And this again was the image used on the front cover of that magazine to illustrate the importance of Battiss. And again, it's self-explanatory, just the marvelous use of unusual combinations of colors that really just work, from the green and black to this very deep maroon, the blue surrounding the bird, and just a very striking composition. This one I must just show because I really always liked this one very much. I've actually seen it down at a coast cottage once, and it just absolutely spoke to the environment and sort of being at the sea. And the title, I think, really sums it up. It's titled Nothing Thinking About Nothing. And it must be one of the best ways of trying to articulate what it is like to have a fantastic beach holiday where you're just at peace and you're not really doing much, but you're having a marvelous time in a perfect climate with a lovely sea in front of you. This is the last silkscreen in the 54, in the series of 54 that Battiss made. It is worth just discussing for a couple of minutes. It's titled Under the Sea. What makes it unique and special within the context of the other 53 that we've gone through to get to this last image is it's the only image that's printed to the edges of the page. So just to go back to give you an idea of how the other images look. We've spoken about this image earlier, Delphi, and all of them are roughly, as a image size, 28 in height by 40 centimeters across. Whereas this image obviously is slightly bigger because it's been printed over the margins and the borders. But it's all these prints were incredibly difficult and technically very challenging to print. But this is incredibly hard to be able to print an image to the edges of the sheet. Because I, by looking at it carefully, can ascertain that it wasn't printed and then the sheet trimmed down. He actually worked the plate out and the screen out to the micron on each side to be able to print this perfectly to the edges. And the registration is the really complicated part. So it shows Battiss as a true master, as we've discussed earlier, of the Silkscreen process. But what I'd also like to add, that although this image always finishes every copy of Nesos that I've seen, and I've seen about 6 or 7 as I mentioned, and the first plate that we looked at always started with the poem by Sappho in Greek, he obviously had a different reading with these 54 images, and or was entertaining himself in a particular way, because they all have a different order. Now there's an explanation why the prints have a different order, and good for every single collector who has one. In him wanting to make something that challenged the machine age, that challenged the multiple, that challenged the replica, he made every single book by hand, as I've said, every single print by hand. But then when it came to binding them, he only also bound them when he got an order. He probably kept a record of all the previous copies that he had bound, and then he bound the images in a different narrative, in a different sequence. You're not always sure what the narrative is actually saying, or if it's just at random. But it makes it very enjoyable for someone like me, or for Jack Ginsberg, who's seen many, to see the different combinations in the different bindings. So it means that in fact, although you're also buying a multiple, if you're lucky enough to afford and be able to buy one of these books, you're actually buying a unique object, because every single one is assembled uniquely by Battiss person. I think the most important thing a collector or historian must realize about this book is that Battiss himself thought of it as the most important and trying work, or most complicated work that he had ever not just achieved and embarked on, but had successfully completed. And he actually wrote to his dear friend and his confidant and lover, Dacre Punt, in London at the time when he embarked on starting the process of printing, where he actually wrote him and said it's his most trying effort as he sits with his shirt off, or stands with his shirt off in his garden in the hot African sun, making these prints one by one. And he said that it was literally his most trying effort and the work that he was most proud of making. So I think that although it's in book form, and although it constitutes 54 silkscreens, one must realize, and particularly as a collector, that you're very privileged and very lucky if you have the opportunity to not only see and hold a work of this quality, but own it in your collection, because it gives you immense and open-ended joy, because there are just so many ways you can read it and look at it, keep it open and refer to it and place it back in the cupboard or on a shelf and look at it time and time again.